In this lesson, first we'll discuss international credits, namely Clean Development Mechanism (CDM) and Joint Implementation (JI), and their role in climate change mitigation objectives. Next, we discuss the emission trading scheme of China, including its pilot and national carbon markets. Further, we also discuss emission trading systems from UK and compare it with European Union emission trading system. In this video, we'll introduce international credits, namely Clean Development Mechanism and Joint Implementation. We'll also highlight their role in achieving climate change mitigation in the context of European Union. International credits are financial instruments that represent 1 ton of CO2 or carbon removed or reduced from the atmosphere as a result of an emission reduction project. At present, international credits are generated through two key mechanisms set up under Kyoto Protocol. These are Clean Development Mechanism and Joint Implementation JI, CDM and JI. In this backdrop, this Clean Development Mechanism allows industrialized countries with a greenhouse gas reduction commitment, these are called Annex 1 countries, to invest in projects that reduce emissions in developing countries as an alternative to more expensive emission reductions in their own countries. Next, we have Joint Implementation Mechanism, JI. JI allows industrialized countries to meet part of their required cuts in greenhouse gas emissions by paying for projects that reduce emissions in other industrialized countries. Here, joint implementation provides for the creation of emission reduction units or ERUs, whereas Clean Development Mechanism provides the creation of certified emission reductions. These CERs can be traded and sold and used by industrialized countries to meet a part of their emission reduction targets under Kyoto Protocol. These emission reduction units or ERUs and CERs are basically account for the same amount of reduction but differ in their origin. So CERs they originate from CDM projects, while ERUs they originate from joint implementation or JI based projects. Sometimes the term emission reductions ERs is used when talking about the project based mechanisms in general. Each unit represents a reduction in 1 ton of CO2 equivalent emissions. Here, participants in EU-ETS can use international credits from CDM and JI towards fulfilling part of their obligations under the EU-ETS, subject to qualitative and quantitative restrictions till 2020. The EU has a domestic emission reduction target and does not currently envisage continuing of these international credits for EU-ETS compliance after 2020, so a mechanism is stipulated. To meet their Kyoto targets under the burden sharing agreement, most of the European countries plan to make use of their flexible project mechanisms, namely CDM and JI. In the Kyoto Protocol from 1997, the EU members agreed to cut down their overall greenhouse gas emissions related to their 1990 levels by 8% in the period 2008 to 2012. Over time, this pressure to reach the targets has become even stronger, and many countries realize that they have to start acting in order to achieve their targets. As most countries are aware, they will not be able to reduce their emissions sufficiently with domestic action alone. They want to make use of flexible mechanisms of Kyoto Protocol, focusing on these project-based mechanisms, namely CDM and JI. These project-based mechanisms have been designed to help countries to accomplish their Kyoto Protocol targets in an economically efficient and environmentally effective manner. It must be noted that this rationale behind project-based mechanism is that it is of secondary importance for the global environment where the emission reductions occur. Provided that real emission reductions are indeed achieved, many of the European governments have already advanced plans to make use of CDM and JI. In some cases, considerable parts of necessary emission reductions are hoped to be achieved abroad via these mechanisms. Also, these CDM and JI are important for European countries, for European emission trading scheme for CO2 that is a major component of European climate strategy. In addition, CDM and JI will also play an important role within the emission trading system as a linking between the ETS and the two project-based mechanisms has been established that allows to recognize JI and CDM credits as equivalent to EU's emission allowances, UAs. Now, to make sure that a real emission reduction takes place, credits from CDM and JI projects can only be generated if they are additional to what would have occurred in the absence of the project. Therefore, a baseline scenario has to be developed and justified by the project participants before the project is implemented. It has to show what would have happened in terms of emission in the absence of the project. Lastly, the situation in the European Union gives the possibility to make use of JI and CDM on both private and government level. For example, governments can use JI and CDM credits to comply with their national Kyoto Proto reduction targets. Private entities that are covered by the EU-ETS can convert these CERs and ERUs into allowances that can be used in the EU-ETS. This became possible with the so-called linking directive, which wants to ensure that private actors can obtain their responsibilities within the European climate policy in the cheapest possible manner. To summarize, in this video, we discussed how parties to Kyoto Protocol and EU member nations can benefit from international credits like CDM and JI in achieving their climate change objectives and reducing the emissions in a real and substantial manner. In this video, we will further deepen our understanding about international credits, namely Clean Development Mechanism (CDM) and Joint Implementation (JI). First, the Clean Development Mechanism (CDM). It allows for emission reduction projects in developing countries to earn certified emission reductions or CR credits, each equivalent to 1 ton of CO2. 1 ton of CO2. These CRs can be then traded, sold, and used by industrialized countries to meet a part of their emission reduction targets under Kyoto Protocol. The mechanism stipulates sustainable development and emission reductions while giving industrialized countries some flexibility in how they meet their emission reduction limitation targets. Moreover, Article 12 of the Kyoto Protocol gives the possibility for emission reductions in non-Annex 1 countries which have no emission reduction targets. The purpose of Clean Development Mechanism shall be to assist parties not included in Annex 1 countries in achieving sustainable development and in contributing to the fulfillment of the ultimate objective of the convention, that is to assist parties included in Annex 1 in achieving compliance with their quantified emission limitation and reduction commitments under Article 3. Furthermore, Annex 1 countries here can then use the certified emission reductions which they obtain from CDM project to contribute to their reduction compliance. Thus, the Clean Development or CDM mechanism also gives the possibility for emission reductions in developing countries, that is non-Annex countries, non-Annex 1 countries, which themselves have no reduction targets under the Kyoto Protocol, though the investment in environmental projects in the frame of CDM Annex 1 countries are supposed to transfer new and efficient technologies to developing countries and help them in achieving sustainable development. Next, we have joint implementation or JI. The mechanism known as joint implementation or JI, defined in Article 6 of Kyoto Protocol, allows a country with an emission reduction or limitation commitment under the Kyoto Protocol with Annex B commitment party to earn emission reduction units or ERUs from an emission reduction or emission removal project in another Annex B committed party, each equivalent to 1 ton of CO2 equivalent emission, which can be counted towards meeting its Kyoto target. Joint implementation offers parties a flexible and cost-efficient means of fulfilling a part of their Kyoto commitments, while the host party benefits from foreign investment and technology transfer. Please note here that JI is the project-based mechanism referred to in Article 6 of the Kyoto Protocol. JI stipulates and stimulates investment in emission reduction projects while giving industrialized countries and economies in transition some flexibility in how they meet their emission reduction or limitation targets. Joint implementation here, JI, allows industrialized countries to meet part of their required cuts in greenhouse gas emissions by paying for projects that reduce emission in other industrialized countries. Precisely, JI differs from CDM or clean development mechanisms in a way that it represents a way for industrialized countries and basically Annex 1 parties with a commitment inscribed in Annex B of the Kyoto Protocol to take part in emission reduction projects or a project that enhances removals by sinks in the territory of another industrialized countries, for example, Annex 1 party with an Annex B commitment. Moreover, as JI emission reduction units or ERUs, each equivalent to 1 ton of CO2. The resulting ERUs from these projects can be counted toward meeting their own Kyoto Proto targets, KP targets. Also, following Article 6 of the Kyoto Protocol, GI allows Annex 1 parties to implement projects that reduce emissions or increase removal by sinks in the territories of other Annex 1 parties. Emission reduction units generated by such projects can then be used by investing Annex parties to meet their emission targets. As GI projects take place between Annex 1 parties, the total emission permitted in the countries remain the same, so that GI basically a zero sum game. So it's a zero sum operation as both investor and host countries benefit from a GI project. It is expected that both countries will strike a fair balance. So joint implementation or GI allows Annex 1 parties of the Kyoto Protocol to implement projects that reduce emissions or increase removals by sinks in the territories of Annex 1 parties. And ERU generated by such projects can then be used by investing Annex 1 parties to fulfill their Kyoto commitments. To summarize this video, we further understood in greater detail about CDM and JI and how EU member nations, particularly those that are party to Kyoto Protocol and have some commitment therein, they can make use of or benefit from these CDM and JI project-based mechanisms and also facilitate reduction in carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions and benefit the environment. In this video, we'll conclude with our understanding and discussion about CDM and JI, that is international credits. As the world's largest carbon market, the EU-ETS is currently the biggest source of demand for these international credits and making it the main driver of international carbon market and the main provider of clean energy investment in developing countries and economies in transition. Since phase 3, CRs and ERUs are no longer compliance units within the EU-ETS and must be exchanged for EU-ETS emission allowances. Operators must request the exchange of CRs and ERUs for general allowances up to their individual entitlement limit set within the European Union registry. To be precise, there are three possibilities to acquire CDM and JI credits. These JI credits and CDM projects. CDM projects are in non-Annex 1 developing countries, while JI projects are in Annex 1 industrialized countries and economies in transition. The first one is to undertake CDM and JI projects. This option is particularly attractive for international funds and establishments in non-Annex 1 or transformation countries in which CDM and JI projects can be undertaken. Now here, once the EU ETS firm reports ERUs and CRs to government authority in step 1, in the second step, the government authority exchanges ERUs and CRs for additional allowance allocation units which are traded in EU ETS. So these additional allowances are introduced to the EU ETS as the last step. And government issues these AAUs to affect installations. Thus, EU ETS here facilitates and helps the countries to reach their Kyoto targets. The second step or second way is to buy the ERUs and CRs from somebody who directly undertakes CDM. Now, this second step or second option is very attractive or mostly chosen by governments which issue tenders for CDM and JI projects by private investors from which they want to buy the CRs and ERUs. So governments use these ERUs and CRs to fulfill their national Kyoto targets, and that's why this is useful for them. The third possible option is to invest in a fund that finances CDM and JI projects and acquires the ERUs and CRs. So this option employs to invest in a carbon fund that collects money to finance CDM and JI projects. The general procedure is that the fund selects the JI and CDM projects from which emission credits are to be acquired, following a transparent procurement procedures. To summarize this video and conclude the discussion, emission reductions abroad via CDM and JI projects are likely to play a very important role for meeting the European Kyoto commitments. On the one hand, governments can use these flexible Kyoto mechanisms to require less severe emission reductions restrictions by domestic households and domestic industry. On the other hand, firms covered by the upcoming European emissions trading scheme will be able to exchange the CDM and JI credits to emission allowances for their use within the scheme. In this video, we'll introduce emission trading systems in China, in particular its pilot and national carbon markets. In 2011, the Chinese government selected 7 provinces, namely Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, Guangdong, Shenzhen, Hubei, Chongqing, to launch pilot carbon emission trading schemes. These pilot markets made great efforts in system design, technical development, and capacity building. These 7 pilot carbon markets with different characteristics were launched between 2013 and 14. In addition, the Chinese province Fujian launched its ETS in September 2016. Let us start with 2 of the pilot carbon markets, including Beijing and Guangdong. Both these markets started in 2013. Guangdong was implemented in a phase-wise manner, with phase 1 first 3 years from 13 to 15, then phase 2 16 to 20, and currently we are in phase 3. The average allowance price in 2022 was around $13.85 for Beijing, $11.35 for Guangdong. For both the pilot carbon markets, banking is allowed, but borrowing is not allowed. The trading takes place in both these markets with BEA in Beijing, that is Beijing Carbon Emission Allowances, and Guangdong Emission Allowance, GDA in Guangdong. CCR or China Certified Emission Reduction Carbon Credits are also traded in both the markets. The method of allowance allocation has been free allocation in Beijing through grandfathering and benchmarking. In November 2022, the first auction was held since 2013, generating a total revenue of US $16.4 million. In Guangdong also, free allocation through grandfathering and benchmarking remains a major mode. It also auctions a small share of allowances. Next, we have markets from Hubei and Shanghai. Hubei market started in 2014 and Shanghai started in 2013. Shanghai was implemented in phases, with phase 1 in 2013 to 15 was trial phase, and then 16 onwards we are in phase 2. The average allowance price was $6.95 in 2022 in Hubei and $5.96 in Shanghai. Now here banking is allowed and borrowing is not allowed. In Hubei, the spots product included Hubei emission allowances and CCRs. The HBEAs or Hubei emission allowances spot forward product was introduced in 2016 but has not been traded since May 2017. In Shanghai market, products include Shanghai emission allowances SHEA and Shanghai emission allowance forwards and CCRs. The allowance allocation mechanism in Hubei has been primarily free allocation through grandfathering and benchmarking, although several ad hoc auctions have been held since 2015. In Shanghai, the allowances have been primarily freely allocated through grandfathering and benchmarking. A small share of the annual cap is auctioned. One auction was held in each of the following years, including 14, 16, 18, and 2019. Since then, 2 auctions have been held each year. Next, we have Shenzhen and Tianjin. The launch date is 2013 for both the markets, and currently they are implemented in phases. The average allowance allocation price was $6.31. This is the average price of allowance being traded in Shenzhen market, and $5.1 is the average allowance secondary trading price in Tianjin. For both the markets, banking is allowed and borrowing is not allowed. In Shenzhen, CCRs, Shenzhen allowances, SZAs are main traded products. In Tianjin market, products include spot Tianjin carbon emission allowances and spot CCRs. In Shenzhen, allowance has been primarily freely allocated through grandfathering and benchmarking. So far, 2 auctions have held in 2014 June and August 2022, generating a total revenue of approximately $3.67 million. In Tianjin, allowances have been primarily freely allocated again through both grandfathering and benchmarking methods. Lastly, we have the pilot market of Chongqing and national carbon market. The Chongqing market started in 2014, while the national carbon market started in 2021 and ongoing. The average allowance traded price in Chongqing has been in the range of $5.86, while the national carbon market, it has been in the range of $8.2. For both the markets, banking is allowed and borrowing is not allowed. In Chongqing, there is a spot market for carbon emission trading center for trading of allowances and CCRs. No derivative trading is allowed. In national carbon market, emission allowances can be traded on a dedicated traded platform managed by Shanghai Environment and Energy Exchange (SEE), and derivative trading is currently not allowed. For Chongqing, the allowance have been primarily freely allocated through both grandfathering and benchmarking, and auctioning was introduced in 2021. For national carbon market, free allocation of allowances through benchmarking was done as of 2021. Gradually, auctioning method has been introduced. To summarize, in this video, we discussed the particulars of 7 pilot carbon markets and the national carbon market. We discussed about their implementation in phases. We also discussed the average allowance traded price and the policies related to banking borrowing. We also discussed what kind of products are traded in secondary market trading. And we also discussed briefly about their allowance allocation methods. In the next set of videos, we will discuss about their market size, volume, and market microstructure. In this video, we'll continue with our discussion of China's pilot and national carbon market trading schemes. In particular, we'll discuss the size and brief snapshot of market size and turnover of Chinese markets, and start the discussion with the carbon market at Beijing. Let us have a quick snapshot of China's carbon markets. As we can see, in all the 7 and the new market fusion, the total volume of carbon allowances is 51.52 million tons, and in terms of value it amounted to 370.32 million euros. The average traded price in euros per ton was 7.19. As we can see, the Guangdong has the highest traded volume here, 14.45, while in terms of value it was 145.78 million euros. Across all the markets, they are all heavily traded with volume ranging from 3 to 7 million tons, while in terms of value it is around 20 to 50 million euros. The average price varies from 3 to 10 and averages around 7.19 euro per ton. So the markets have been fairly liquid and heavily traded. Let us start our discussion with the Beijing's carbon market. It launched in November 2013, and since then it is continuing with the first phase itself. In terms of average allowance prices, the average auction price was around 17.44 US dollars, while the secondary market price in 2022 was around $13.85. The total revenue generated from this program amounted to 16.8 million US dollars since 2022, since the beginning of the program. The Beijing pilot market has seen a relatively high carbon price compared to other emission trading systems in China. In this market, banking is allowed, borrowing is not allowed. Next, in the Beijing market, the primary allocation of allowances or primary market consists of allowance distribution through free allocation. Also, there is a provision of 5% of allowances through regular and irregular auctions. The secondary trading consists of 5 spot products, namely Beijing Carbon Emission Allowances (BA) (CCRs), Forest Certified Emission Reductions (FCR), Green Transport Certified Emission Reductions (GTCR), and Energy Saving Projects Certified Emissions (PCR). The Beijing Green Exchange manages the trading of all 5 products. Due to financial market regulations in China, no forward markets or derivative products are allowed. The compliance period is 1 calendar year from January to December, and the covered entities have until mid-June of the next year to surrender and furnish the required allowances. Next, we have market stability provisions, which include first flooring and ceiling. So the competent authority can auction extra allowances if the weighted average price exceeds $22.26 for 10 consecutive days. It can also buy back allowances from the market using a special funding resource from the municipal budget if prices are below $2.97. In terms of exchange, the Beijing Green Exchange implements a system of limits on price increases and decreases for trading over the exchange, which is around plus minus 20% of the reference price. The reference price here is the weighted average price of all transactions on the previous trading day. This is to prevent large volatility and price fluctuations. The exchange also sets the maximum position limit for different market participants, which is the sum of their annual allocated allowances plus 1 million tons of compliance entities, 1 million tons for compliance entities and 1 million tons for institutional investors, and 50,000 tons for natural persons, individuals. The reserve, in terms of reserve, the competent authority may set up 5% of allowances as reserve for regular and irregular auctions. To summarize, in this video, we saw a brief snapshot of revenue and volumes of allowances across the pilot markets of China. We also discussed the market microstructure of the Beijing market in detail. In next videos, we will see the market microstructure and details of other pilot markets. In this video, we'll discuss the market microstructure of Guangdong, Hubei, and Shanghai pilot carbon markets. The Guangdong market started in December 2013. It was first Chinese carbon pilot to start the operation and covered around 40% of the city's emissions in 2021. It has a very broad sectoral coverage. The Guangdong emission trading system is the largest of Chinese emission trading system pilots in terms of market size and spot trading volume. It has been implemented in phases. The first phase running from 2013 to 15, second phase running for 5 years from 16 to 20, and the third phase which is ongoing from 2021 onwards. As the first Chinese region to introduce auctioning as a method of allowance allocation, Guangdong held quarterly auctions till 2016. Since 2017, auctions have been held on an ad hoc basis, and CEEX exchange organizes auctions for the primary market. We have Guangdong Emission Allowance GDA as the main spot trading product in the secondary market. Bidding transfer has been introduced in 2020 to organized auctions for covered entities to enhance market efficiency for the secondary market. Other products include CCRs, PHCRs. They are also traded in the secondary market, and all products are traded on CEEX exchange. For this market, the compliance period is one calendar year from January to December, and covered entities have until June to August for the following year to surrender allowances. So they surrender allowances in the following year for the previous year emissions. Next, we have Hubei market. It was launched in April 2014. It covers around a quarter of province emissions. Hubei's carbon market system covers around 339 entities and a broad range of industrial subsectors. Unlike other Chinese pilots, Hubei does not predefine which sectors are covered under its ETS. Rather, it sets a threshold level which applies to all the industrial sectors. Allowances have primarily been freely allocated through both grandfathering and benchmarking approaches, although they have several ad hoc auctions which are held since 2014. And Hubei has been one of the most active regional markets in China in terms of trading and has the largest market in terms of spot trading volume after Guangdong. It is also one of the regional pioneers for allowance forward trading in China. Next, for Hubei, the primary market for issuances include China Hubei Emission Exchange, which organizes ad hoc auctions for the primary market. Since 2019, Hubei has held 2 separate rounds of auctions targeting different types of entities in each compliance year. The secondary market products include spot products with Hubei emission allowances or HBAs and CCRs. The HBA spot forward contract was introduced in 2016 but has not traded since May 2017, and China Hubei Emission Exchange manages trading of all the products. Coming to the compliance period, it is one calendar year from January to December. The covered entities have until the last working day of May of the following year to surrender allowances. In practice, in most compliance years, the exact date for the covered entities to surrender allowances is set by the government on an annual basis and varies across the years. Coming to the market stability provisions, Hubei market has a provision for reserve which is 8% of the total cap kept as a government reserve for market stabilization. In terms of interventions, in case of market fluctuations or severe demand supply imbalances or liquidity issues, the Hubei exchange, Hubei EEB, in consultation with an advisory committee consisting of government institutions and other stakeholders, can buy or sell allowances in order to stabilize the market. More specifically, the Hubei EEB takes action if the allowance price reaches a low or high point 6 times during a 20-day period. Also, the exchange sets day-to-day price fluctuation limit of 10% movement in either direction. The auctioning mechanism is also there, where a small share of the annual cap can be auctioned. The main purpose of these auctions is to promote price discovery and provide regulated entities with additional supply to meet their compliance demand. Till date, auctions have been held on an ad hoc basis and they took place in 2014, 19, 20, 21 and 22. Moreover, recent years have seen 2 auctions per year, with the first auction for regulated entities only and the second open to all the participants. Next, we have Shanghai Exchange. Shanghai Exchange was launched in November 2013 and was the second region to start its pilot ETS. It covered around 36% of the city's emissions. Phase 1 of this exchange from 2013 to 15, also known as the trial phase, and phase 2 was 2016 to present. So it has been implemented in 2 phases. It also employs market stability provisions, first from exchange. Depending upon the transaction type, if prices vary by 10% or 30% in one day, the SEEE exchange can institute price stabilization measures such as temporarily suspending the trading or imposing holding limits. For reserve, a small share of the annual cap can be kept in a reserve for auctioning before the end of the annual compliance cycle as market stability reserve. Next, coming to the market types. So first we have primary issuances where no set percentage of allowance are allocated by auctioning, though the Shanghai ETS regulations said that auctioning is to be introduced gradually. Presently, ad hoc auctions have been held since 2014 to provide compliance entities with additional supply. In addition, further auctions have also been held since 2020 where institutional investors have been allowed to participate. Secondary market products include Shanghai emission allowances, Shanghai emission allowance forwards, and CCRs, SHEAs, and CCERs. These are spot products. In terms of banking and borrowing rules, banking is allowed both within and across trading periods with some restrictions for the latter. For banked allowances from the first trading period 13 to 15, only 1/3 per year could be used by compliance entities between 16 and 18. Allowances are bankable. For institutional investors without such annual maximum limit, borrowing is not allowed. The compliance period runs calendar year to calendar year and covered entities must surrender allowances in June of the following year, following to the current emission. To summarize, in this video, we discussed the market microstructure of Guangdong, Hubei, and Shanghai. In particular, we discussed the market dates, the implementation in phases, the market stability provisions, market types, and banking borrowing rules and compliance period for these three markets. In this video, we'll discuss the market microstructure of three key important markets, including Shenzhen, Chongqing, and Tianjin. To begin with, Shenzhen pilot market began in June 2013 and was the first of the Chinese pilot to start the operation. It covers around 36% of the city's emissions and it began in phases from 2013 onwards. The methods included allowance allocation, benchmarking, grandfathering, and auctioning. As per the latest regulations for auctioning, as per the provincial regulation for Shenzhen Emission Trading Pilot Scheme published in 2022, it says that allowances can be sold at auction or at fixed price. At least 3% of allowances should be auctioned. So far, two auctions have been conducted in June 2014 and 2022 August. The compliance period runs from calendar to calendar year and covered entities have until the end of August of the following year to surrender allowances. Next, we have Tianjin pilot market. It was launched in December 2013. It covers around 50% of the city's emissions as per the 2020 data and emissions are covered for around 140 entities. It is currently running its first phase from 2014 onwards till present. And first, the market types. Primary issuances of allowances are freely allocated, so free allocation. Tianjin Climate Exchange TC organizes ad hoc auctions as well for primary market. Between 2019 and 2021, it held 5 auctions. In terms of secondary market trading, the products include spot Tianjin carbon emission allowances, TCEAs, and spot CCERs. Also, Tianjin Climate Exchange manages trading of all the products. Next, in terms of compliance period, it is 1 calendar year and covered entities have until the end of June of the following year to surrender allowances. The average allowance traded price in secondary market was around $5.1 and total revenues since the beginning amounted to approximately $22 million since the beginning of the program. Lastly, we have Chongqing pilot market. It was launched in June 2014. This emission trading system covers around 51% of the city's emissions as per the 2020 data and 152 entities are covered. It is running and implemented in one phase since 2014 and ongoing. In this market, banking is allowed and borrowing is not allowed. In terms of market types, the primary issuances, so far allowances are mainly allocated for free and auctioning was introduced in 2021 without a fixed schedule. 2 auctions have been held so far. The secondary market trading include products like spot market at Chongqing Carbon Emission Trading Center for trading of allowances, CCRs. Due to the financial market related regulations in China, no forward markets or derivatives are allowed yet. In terms of market stability provisions, the draft measures state that a certain number of allowances from the cap could be set aside for several purposes, including market stability. However, there are no details for the market stability mechanism yet. The compliance market runs for calendar year to calendar year. The exact date for the covered entities to surrender allowances set by the government on an annual basis and varies across the years. To summarize, in this video, we discussed the key market microstructure details of the Chinese pilot markets, including Tianjin, Chongqing, and Shenzhen. The details included their launch, the coverage of the market, the implementation in phases, the provisions for banking borrowing, market types, including primary market issuances, and the mechanism for secondary trading, the instrument traded in secondary markets. We also discussed their market stability provisions and the compliance period details. In this video, we'll introduce China's national carbon market. China's national emission trading system or national carbon market began trading in July 2021 and currently operates in parallel with a number of pilot schemes. Each is called pilot scheme. China's ability to peak emissions by 2030 and be carbon neutral by 2060 is called 3060 strategy, which relies in part on its ability to demonstrate to the world that it has the necessary infrastructure in place to maintain the integrity of the system and has created to realize its 3060 strategy. The Chinese national market or national ETS is a regulated cap and trade based system. It's a regulated cap and trade based system covering 2,162 entities. These are called covered entities, each of which emit at least greater than 26,000 tons of carbon in one or more years between 2013 and 19. The national ETS is a mandatory regulated scheme with which all covered entities must apply. The first compliance period for the national ETS concluded at the end of 2021 with the Ministry of Ecology and Environment reporting that covered entities representing 99.5% of the emissions have complied. Now, China's emission controls are expanding both in terms of industry sector coverage and the volume of energy consumed. While there is currently no timetable in place, the national ETS will gradually expand to cover more entities, more sectors, and more products. Around 17 carbon intensive industries have been identified by the National Development and Reform Commission as candidates for coverage by the national ETS, including iron, steel, non-ferrous metals, cement, flat glass, ceramic, paper, construction, and non-ferrous metals, and oil refining. Now, currently only China emission allowances, each representing 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide emissions, are traded on national ETS. These CAs are allocated free of charge at entity level according to 70% of historical output multiplied by the benchmark factor, that is according to the volume and source of the energy produced. Chinese ETS is the world's largest in terms of covered emissions, estimated to cover more than 4 billion ton of CO2 and accounting for 40% of the country's emissions. The emissions cap under the national ETS is the aggregate of all the CAs that are allocated to all the covered entities for the relevant period, and the cap is currently set to by reference to 2019-2020 output levels. Historically, China has only set intensity-based targets rather than absolute cap on tons of carbon dioxide emitted. Also, China has indicated that it will move away from the free allocation of CAs towards a bidding auction kind of system in alignment with its 60-30 strategy. These CAs can be traded on a dedicated platform operated by Shanghai Environment and Energy Exchange (SWEX). Covered entities must surrender sufficient CAs to cover their actual emissions for the relevant compliance period after surrendering the volume of CAs required to offset their actual emissions. Covered entities with surplus CAs may either sell them to covered entities whose actual emissions exceed their CA allocation or carry them to the next compliance period. Trading of CAs is currently on spot terms only. However, the China Securities Regulatory Commission issued a statement confirming that it plans to establish a carbon emission futures market to supplement the national ETS to be operated by the Guangdong Futures Exchange. However, there is no currently timetable in place. Lastly, the covered entities may offset up to 5% of their annual verified emissions for compliance purposes through the purchase of CCR, China Certified Emission Reductions, CCRs. It is intended that the pilot schemes will eventually form part of the national ETS. However, there is no currently timetable for the same. It is expected that this integration of pilot schemes into national ETS will take place on a staggered basis. This CCR is essentially an offset mechanism. It was launched in 2013. So the CCR scheme was halted in 2017 and then resurrected in 2021. when the MEE issued a notice allowing covered entities to use pre-existing CCRs to offset up to 5% of their annual verified emissions for the compliance purposes with no restrictions on project type or vintage. The national trading platform for CCR is hosted by Beijing Green Exchange. China is expected to relaunch the national CCR scheme during 2020 in order to redress the balance between the fossil fuel-based energy producers and renewable energy companies. These CCRs may be traded within the voluntary market subject to compliance with the rules applicable to the applicable pilot scheme, and participants may trade CCRs within a pilot scheme even if the project generating the CCR is located in a different region. The following are some of the key provisions under the national measures and the implementation rules for China's national ETS. First, the participants, currently only onshore covered entities, may trade CAs. Exchanges, the Shanghai Environment and Energy Exchange SEE is responsible for trading of CAs, while the China Hubei Emission Exchange CHEE is responsible for registration of CAs. Trading method, trading of CAs is conducted electronically and on spot delivery terms, that is trading carbon certificates with immediate payment and delivery by way of one-way bidding or transfer of agreement. In terms of trading declaration, it shall include the trader's number, trading number, code of product, trading direction, declaration amount, declaration price and other information as may be required by SEE. Single trades, the maximum threshold for a single trade is 1 lakh ton of carbon and pricing may fluctuate plus minus 10% from the previous day's trading. For block trades, the minimum threshold for a block trade is 1 lakh tons of carbon and the pricing may fluctuate 30% from the previous day's trading. The block trades may only be carried out by one-way bidding. Trading accounts, a covered entity may open a single account in its own name in order to trade CAs, and restrictions on the same day transfer. So CAs that have been purchased may not be sold again on the same day. The settlement period here are the trades are settled on a delivery versus payment DVP, delivery versus payment basis at the end of the trading day. To summarize the Chinese national ETS, it is regulated by MEE, which operates through the exchanges of two of the pilot schemes. First, the Shanghai Environment and Energy Exchange SEE, which is responsible for trading of CAs, and the China Hubei Exchange Emission Exchange, which is responsible for registration of CAs. The legal basis and governance structure of the national ETS was established in 2021 pursuant to the national measures of the Administration of Trading and Carbon Emission Rights, the national measures. The national measures are supplemented by the detailed implementation rules relating to the registration, trading and settlement of CAs, which is China Emission Allowances, which together form the legislative framework and basis for the operation of national ETS. These CAs can be traded on a dedicated platform operated by the Shanghai Environment and Energy Exchange, and covered entities must surrender sufficient CAs to cover their actual emissions for the relevant compliance period. After surrendering the volume of CAs required to offset their actual emissions, the covered entities with surplus CAs may either sell them to the covered entities whose actual emissions exceed their CA allocation or carry the surplus CAs over to the next compliance period. Moreover, covered entities may offset up to 5% of their annual verified emissions for compliance purposes through the purchase of CCR generated through a pilot scheme. To summarize, in this video, we discussed the mechanisms and operation of Chinese national ETS. In this video, we'll discuss the key features of UK emission trading system. To begin with, the UK emission trading system started operating in 2021 following the departure of UK from European Union EU ETS. Verified emissions from the stationary UK ETS operators currently cover around a quarter of the UK's territorial greenhouse gas emissions. The first phase of UK ETS runs till 2030. UK ETS covers around 1,000 entities in the power industrial sectors as well as aviation within the UK and flights departing from UK to Switzerland and the European Economic Area. Allowances are primarily allocated through auctioning, with a portion freely allocated to safeguard the competitiveness of emissions intensive trade exposed sectors and minimize the risk of carbon leakage. As of 2021, 1,000 entities are covered under UK ETS. Compliance period runs from calendar year to calendar year. Covered entities have until the end of April of the following year to surrender the allowances. These provisions are the same as under EU ETS. The trading hours are from 7 AM to 5 PM UK time. In terms of market types, the primary issuances takes place through majority of allowances are allocated through auctioning. Auctioning is held every 2 weeks with dates and allowances amount set out in the auction calendar. Compliance entities, financial institutions, and business groupings and public bodies acting on behalf of compliance entities can participate. Auctions are managed through ICE Futures Europe. Secondary market instruments include UKs, which are traded on the ICE Futures Europe exchange. Contracts for daily futures, futures and options on futures contract are available. Participants in the secondary market must meet the requirements of the ICE Futures exchange and have an account in the UK registry. Participants may also trade allowances over the counter. Looking at the price fluctuations of allowances in EU-ETS and UK-ETS, it seems that the prices at UK-ETS slightly higher, but they move pretty much in tandem with the EU allowances. As we can see here, there seems to be a high correlation and they fluctuate together. And given that the size of UK-ETS is about 7% of its EU counterpart, the turnover is also similar in terms of the fraction. For example, the total market value was similar proportionally, with the UK-ETS transactions collectively worth around 47 billion, or about 7% of the EU-ETS 751 billion market value in 2022, and they seem to be pretty much co-integrated. In fact, UK-ETS, the installations were earlier part of EU-ETS only. To summarize, in this video, we discuss the market microstructure and key features of UK-ETS, which is one of the major trading systems, emission trading systems in the world. To summarize this video, international credits are financial instruments that represent 1 ton of CO2 removed or reduced from the atmosphere as a result of an emission reduction project. Predominantly, two such mechanisms exist, namely Clean Development Mechanism (CDM) and Joint Implementation (JI). The CDM mechanism allows emission reduction or emission removal projects in developing countries to earn certified emission reductions or CERs, each equivalent to 1 ton of CO2. These CRs can be traded and sold and used by industrialized countries to meet part of their emission reduction targets under the Kyoto Protocol. Joint implementation, that is JI, represents a way for industrialized countries or Annex 1 parties with a commitment inscribed in Annex P of the Kyoto Protocol to take part in emission reduction projects or a project that enhances removals by sinks in the territory of another industrialized country, that is Annex 1 party with an Annex B commitment. It differs from the Clean Development Mechanism in the sense that it represents a way for industrialized countries, that is Annex 1 parties, with a commitment inscribed in Annex B of the Kyoto Protocol to take part in emission reduction projects or a project that enhances removals by sinks in the territory of another industrialized country. For example, Annex 1 party with an Annex B commitment. Next, we discuss the Chinese ETS market. China's emission trading system comprises 1 national and 8 regional pilot markets, including Beijing, Guangdong, Hubei, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Tianjin, Chongqing, and Fuzhou. The total volume in these markets amounted to 51.52 million ton in terms of volume and 370.32 million euros in terms of value. The average price was 7.19 euro per ton. All of these markets include heavily traded spot markets, including China certified emission reduction credits. The allowance allocation is done through grandfathering, benchmarking, and auction mechanisms. The compliance period followed is calendar year. These markets also create provisions for market stability in the form of circuit breakers and allowance reserves. Lastly, UK-ETS has grown into a successful scheme after Brexit. The price evolution in the UK-ETS is similar and heavily correlated with European Union emission trading system.